both, so I'm just coordinating that. And go good. To start with, as we've been doing the last few classes, we can so we're in Maitreya's text, the Uttara Tantra Sublime Continuum. We're studying the section on the first three Vajra points, which connect to refuge. So let's just slowly once kind of go through the verse of refuge in bodhicitta, contemplating it according to the teachings of Maitreya. So we start with I go for refuge. And so again, pause and reflect on, what's the nature of the I who goes for refuge?
Recording in progress.
So if the I were, for example, permanent, then it couldn't go for refuge. If the I were intrinsically existent, right, not dependently risen, then it couldn't go for refuge. It couldn't change. The I is impermanent, right? The basis of designation of the I is impermanent. And the I lacks any independent or inherent intrinsic nature. And the emptiness of the I means that you have Buddha nature. You have the potential to become enlightened. So that's the kind of I who turns for refuge. Your nature and my nature. Our nature is one that's empty of an intrinsic existence and therefore has the potential to become a Buddha. So that I turns for refuge. First object of refuge is the Buddha jewel. And I go for refuge to Buddha, the Buddha jewel. As Maitreya is teaching, right, that's mainly, here we mainly think of the Dharmakaya, the mind of the Buddha. And that Dharmakaya, mind of the Buddha, completely fulfills one's own aims and also the aims of others. It's up to you. You could think I go for refuge to the Buddha like in the continuum of other beings, like Shakyamuni Buddha and other Buddhas who have achieved enlightenment, who achieve their own welfare and are capable of guiding beings like myself. Or you can think I take refuge, or as well, you can think I take refuge in my own future Buddhahood, which is how Maitreya explains, mainly. So I take refuge in my own future attainment of the Dharmakaya, which will fulfill my own aims for happiness, well-being, bliss, and will allow me to be capable of having compassion and love, the wisdom and the skill and power to accomplish the aims of others. And my own, the deepest compassionate aims to benefit others will be achieved by the Dharmakaya. So that's our ultimate refuge, right? Is genuine refuge that Maitreya is explaining, is the resultant refuge of your own future Dharmakaya of a Buddha. In terms of refuge, then you'll be completely protected. You achieve that from all suffering and its causes, and from all inability to help others. The sense of wanting to achieve our own well-being and the well-being of others, we take refuge in the Buddha, our own future attainment of the mind of we also take refuge in the Dharma. Like it says in the teaching, right? The conventional Dharma, you can think it's like the texts or the teachings, the words. But the ultimate meaning of the Dharma are the paths and the cessations in the mind. And so again, we can think of the resultant refuge. I take refuge in achieving in my own future attainment of the paths that illuminate the nature of reality. Right? Particularly the Arya paths of seeing emptiness directly, which eliminates, right, causes the cessation of the causes of suffering. It's like an ultimate refuge. So ultimately, the Dharma, right, is something realized by the mind. You know, right, the causes of suffering are ignorance and attachment, the mental afflictions. And so the Dharma jewel, right, are the realizations in the mind that eliminate those causes of suffering. So we feel, if we contemplate that, then we feel inspired, like, yes, I really take refuge in the Dharma, which eliminates suffering and its causes for myself and for others. And then the last three jewels, right? I take refuge in the Sangha. Yeah, conventionally can be like think of a community of monastics and so on, but the ultimate Sangha, as explained by Maitreya, are the irreversible bodhisattvas. Particularly here, bodhisattvas who have realized the ultimate truth, who have bodhicitta and have realized the ultimate truth. Particularly, it's referring to the freedom, like the knowledge, wisdom, and the freedom in their minds. And we think, I myself, the resultant refuge of the Sangha is I myself will become that kind of Sangha for the welfare of others. I myself will become an irreversible bodhisattva, which is a kind of deep refuge from suffering and its causes. And notice how it feels, right? If you think of the Sangha external, like our irreversible bodhisattvas currently exist, that's one version of refuge. So beings like Maitreya, Avalokiteshvara, Tara. And then notice how it feels if you think, I take refuge in the Sangha, meaning my own future attainment of such knowledge and freedom in my mind. And can you feel how that then, right, you'll actually have protection from suffering and its causes, and you achieve that state of being the irreversible bodhisattva Sangha. Mm. And so if we think about that, then we may start to feel, yes, like most important thing in my existence is to achieve the resultant refuge, right? To become the Sangha, to realize the Dharma, to become the Buddha, to have the Dharmakaya, that kind of mind. So if you contemplate like that, then you may think, how do I become that? How do I achieve those states, right? To become the three jewels myself. So then the verse of Refuge and Bodhicitta continues to answer that question, right? Through the practices of giving and the other perfections, right? The other paramitas. May I become a Buddha to benefit all beings. And just for a moment, we kind of contemplate that. So if the purpose of my existence is to become enlightened, then how do I do that? By practicing 6 perfections, 10 perfections, but the generosity, ethics, and so on. We can feel like a sense of inspiration or commitment to practicing 6 perfections in order to achieve the resultant state of the 3 jewels. Noticing the verse one more time. So I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, through the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And so that's our practice, refuge and bodhicitta. It's also it's our motivation, right, for studying this text. Is that there's no other reason to study the Uttara Tantra by Maitreya than that. And this text explains how we go about that, the meaning of that. So that one verse is connected to this whole text of Maitreya's. Then maybe we'll return to the text and kind of keep studying it, keep contemplating on this topic though, of refuge. So we already, we're covering the 7 Vajra points, right, that Maitreya explained. And we're up to, so we've been covering, last session we started on the Dharma, we covered the Buddha jewel. Last session we started on the Dharma jewel. And each one, right, each of the 3 jewels, right, so the first 3 Vajra points are the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel. Those the 3 jewels. And each one Maitreya explains in 8 points, right? So each of the 3 jewels he explains covering, using 8 points about them. And in each time you'll notice it's really like it's kind of 6 points, and then the last 2 are the categories. So like they're each time it's like sort of there are 6 points he's using, and then the last 2 are kind of how he categorizes the first 3 and the second 3. So with the Dharma jewel, which is the one we're up to, he covers it in terms of the truth of cessation and the truth of the path. That's how he categorizes the Dharma jewel. And I want to pause today as we're talking about the Dharma jewel and share something. Actually, when one of my teachers, Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche, taught this text, he taught it this way because it's the way it's the proper way to teach it. It's the way Maitreya explains it. And then he paused and he said something that I just thought was useful, so I want to share it. He said, "This is the ultimate refuge. This is truth of cessation and the truth of the past. We need to understand them, and they're what we're aiming for." And then he paused and he said, for us as beginners on the path, he said, of course, like we don't yet have that refuge, right? We haven't realized the ultimate truth directly and become Arya Bodhisattvas. And so he pointed out, he said, there are many, he said, according to the Lamrim and the Lojong teachings, there are many ways in which we can take refuge in the Dharma. And he said, at the very beginning, not harming others, right, is a refuge in the Dharma. Just not harming people, right, and animals and other sentient beings is taking refuge in the Dharma for a beginner, right, for us, in other words. And then also not doing other non-virtuous activities is refuge in the Dharma, right? Not lying, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, and so on. And so he was saying, because actually, if we don't have the ultimate refuge of realizing the nature of mind, according to the way that Maitreya is explaining it, he was saying, then we aspire to that ultimate refuge, but still on this, we have to also start where we're at, right? Which is practicing each step of the path. And there's not another way to proceed to eventually realize the ultimate truth. So we have to begin by training in whichever level of Dharma. And another way of saying that is like, there are countless Dharma teachings, right? There's so many different Dharma teachings. And so whichever ones we've studied, that we have to start by practicing those, of course, because there's no other way to progress, right? So you start with whichever Dharma teachings, and also the ones that we're capable of, right? Because even if you hear a teaching and something very advanced, then it's very good to aspire to that. But then you have to check and say, okay, but I have to start with whichever practices I can actually accomplish. And then if we do those regularly, then and this is one part about Buddha nature, right? This is what this main teaching is. The main topic of the Uttara Tantra is Buddha nature, right? And one point is that's getting at is that we should have hope, actually, because if we practice whichever Dharma teaching we're capable of practicing now, actually, I'm going to say that too, that to think, oh, but I won't be able to realize the ultimate nature of mind is wrong. You will. Because it's your nature to realize that, right? That's what Maitreya is saying. Your nature is Buddha nature, which means you can realize that. But of course, if we're like beginning, then we have to start by, for example, like making offerings in front of the altar, not harming others, not lying, not stealing, and so on. Practicing ethics, practicing kindness to others around us, which activates our developing Buddha nature and helps us to eventually realize the ultimate truth, which is the final refuge, right? The ultimate refuge, what actually protects us from the deepest cause of suffering. And the way Khyentse Rinpoche said it was, he kind of said, and that's true, isn't it? That's the actual refuge that protects us from birth and death. And then he said, but for now, also we have to protect ourselves from, for example, like if we die, going to the lower realms, because then we can't practice dharma. So he said, so then we have to practice ethics, of course, and so on, because that's actually protecting us from dying and going to the lower realms, where then we can't do any kind of practice. So we have to start with those practices, and then we're aiming to these ultimate refuges, right, of dharma. So it's a very good way to explain that, and not to forget, these points. But then Maitreya, and I've been saying this each time. I really, as we study this, I keep remembering the point that Asanga makes, or in his commentary on Maitreya's text, where he says Vajra point. These are Vajra points, right? He says, in one sense, Vajra points means they're not easy. They're hard to penetrate, right? Like a Vajra. Vajra is the diamond, the hardest thing, the indestructible thing. So even Asanga says, these points, these ultimate refuge points, for example, are difficult to understand. They're difficult to penetrate. But then he says, I love that teaching, right, where it says, though, but they're also Vajra points in the sense that they're the words of Maitreya, and that they'll help us penetrate those difficult points. They'll help us understand the ultimate truth. And that by studying this, that's how these kind of teachings is how we get to that understanding of the actual nature of mind. So then in terms of the Dharma jewel, right, I said that each of these are 8, kind of 6 points with 2 categories, so 8 points, but really it's like 6 and then 2 categorize them. And last time we mainly covered, so the way we categorize them are the Dharma jewel are, so half of them cover the truth of cessation, and half of them cover the truth of the path, because the Dharma jewel includes and I said this last time, I'll just remind everybody. So in terms of practice, we practice the truth of the path in order to achieve the truth of cessation, right? So you practice the path to enlightenment in order to achieve the cessation of suffering, cessation, to say cessation, which is the result. But these come in the Four Noble Truths, right? The truth, the truth of suffering, and the truth of the cause of suffering, and the truth of cessation, and the truth of the path, right? So it's the same order in the Four Noble Truths, right? The cessation comes first, then the path. And oftentimes this is explained, right? That it's kind of, that actually the truth, it's kind of funny if you ever think about the Four Noble Truths, right? The truth of suffering, and then the truth of the cause of suffering. Of course, the cause of something always comes before the result, right? Like there is by cause and result, the result can't come before the cause. So the cause of suffering actually comes before suffering. But when the Buddha taught it, he said the truth of suffering, and then he taught the truth of the cause. And I pointed this out last time. It's like let's say it right. The analogy here is like this, actually. Like if somebody, it's a medical analogy, actually. I'm going to give a medical analogy. If somebody had, I'm going to pick an example, diabetes, let's say, right? Certain dietary changes are needed then, right? If you have diabetes, I'm using that as an example. But if a doctor is going to help the person, they have to say, first they have to explain the suffering, right? Oh, you have diabetes. This is the nature of diabetes. This is the, so the person understands what their illness is. Then the doctor says, so you're going to have to make some dietary changes, right, to fix that. Actually, it's diet that causes diet, part of what causes diabetes. So the cause comes first. But when you're going to help somebody, you have to first explain the problem, and then you tell them what they have to change to address the cause of that problem, right? Does that make sense? So this is that's the point, is that they say that, right? That in teaching the cause, the result before the cause, it's a medical reason, it's a practical reason, is that we need to understand that, the Buddha knows what the cause of suffering is first. But for the student, they have to understand, this is your suffering, here's what caused it, so here's what you have to change, right? So it's like that. So here also with cessation and the path, right, the Buddha already practiced the path and achieved cessation. But part of the point is that ordinary people like us don't, people want to be happy, right? But if we don't understand that cessation is the ultimate happiness, then we're not going to want to practice the path to it. Right? So the Buddha has to explain, this is possible. This is what cessation would be. This would be the cessation of all your suffering. This would be remarkable. And then once you become inspired and interested in that, then the Buddha says, here's the path to achieve that. Right? Because if the Buddha just said, oh, here's the path, it'd be a bit like saying, oh, here's the you know, if the person went into their doctor's office and the doctor started just talking about a diet without explaining their problem, then the person wouldn't practice that diet, right? So it's like that. They say that it's a medical. It's like the Buddha is being like a doctor and explained this way. So here in the Dharma Jewel, Maitreya is doing the same thing, right? About the Dharma Jewel. So it's because it's two of the Four Noble Truths: truth of cessation and then truth of the path. And so when Maitreya here explains the Dharma Jewel, right? He explains it in these 8 points, and these I'll go. The first 3 I'm going to go over very quickly because I covered them last time, but just to remind us. So first he says the truth of cessation, right? And he says the first is that it's inconceivable, right? The truth of cessation is inconceivable. And actually, I shouldn't go over it too detailed because we already did. But he says, it's inconceivable in terms of that you can conceive it in terms of the 4 extremes, right? Truly inherent existence, complete non-existence, both existence and non-existence, or neither existence nor non-existence. It can't be understood in any of those 4 ways. Then he says also it's inconceivable in the sense that it's a direct experience of a bodhisattva in meditative absorption. So it can't really fully be explained in terms of language or sounds or symbols. It's beyond words, actually. Words can help lead us there, but the actual experience is beyond words. And then he says the other reason why it's inconceivable is it's realized internally in meditative equipoise by the Arya Bodhisattva in meditation, right? So it's only that kind of experience. It's not something else. So he says that's part of the nature of cessation. And then he makes an important point here, which is he says, and this I think is subtle, so it's good to think about it. He says it's non-dual, it's non-dual, right? A non-duality. And then in the commentary, they say, what does it mean, non-duality, in this context? And they say it's that it's, Asanga says, and also Gyaltsab Je in his commentary, they both say the same thing, which is they first say it's a non-duality with reference to karma and mental afflictions. So in other words, so karma and mental afflictions are the cause of suffering, right? And so one point they're making is cessation is freed from those, you'd say, right? But then they're saying in terms of this non-duality part, and it's connected to the non-conceptuality, what they're getting at, which is a deep point, is that how do karma and mental afflictions arise? And what it's getting at is that they arise because of our dualistic conception of things existing inherently. That's the right way to say it. So we dualistically conceive of self and of other as intrinsically or inherently existing. And once we are caught in that kind of ignorance, right, grasping at things existing that way, then we give rise to mental afflictions, right? Want, craving, want, desire, anger, pride, jealousy, and so on. And then due to those mental afflictions, we take actions. We do actions, which are karma, right? And actions based on the mental afflictions cause birth and death, actually. And cessation is free of all of that. Does that make sense? Because we're free of grasping at things as if they exist in those ways, then we don't give rise to the mental afflictions. Therefore, we don't give rise to karma. And that's the nature of cessation. So that's what's being really explained. And that's where it says the last one too, non-conceptual. And non-conceptual here means there's no, I said this last time briefly, but there's no inappropriate mental engagement. It means that mental engagement with things existing as if in a way they don't exist, right? And there's a beautiful passage in that Asanga quotes, which I won't read the detail, but he says something he quotes the Buddha in a very beautiful way, where the Buddha says, the Buddha says in a way, he doesn't say it, I'm not using exact words, but basically what the Buddha is saying is that cessation is not stopping. Cessation is not, he basically says cessation is not the stopping of something. And what he means is, they kind of explain it. What he means is, let's say this right, that what you were grasping at never existed in the first place. It was a non-existent object, right? So you're not stopping something that actually existed. You were grasping at something in a way that never, it's not that things don't exist, but we grasp at them in a way that's not real. And cessation is a stopping of that, right? So it's not stopping something. You're not like cutting off something that actually existed. You're cutting off a grasping at something that never existed. And when you cut off that kind of grasping, then mental afflictions cease, then karma ceases, and that's the nature of cessation. And cessation then is right, is a state like that where there is no longer grasping at things existing in a way they don't exist. Therefore, there's no longer mental affliction and there's no longer karma. And so the idea here, right, is if you're listening to Maitreya, this is Maitreya's teaching, right, then you start to go, oh wow, that would be quite remarkable, wouldn't it? Like I'd like to achieve that kind of inner state, because that state is a state where, what's I say, right? Ordinarily, when we even try to find happiness, right, it's some kind of like, it's not reliable, is it? Because our minds aren't reliable. So in other words, if you're looking for happiness through some external circumstances, we know they're not reliable, are they? They're never, and it's actually quite clear, isn't it? There are no external circumstances that you can rely on over time. But this is an inner state that is reliable. Right? A state of being, a state of mind that is reliable. And that's a well-being or freedom or liberation that's achieved oneself, and that nobody can take away from you, right? If you achieve this in your mind. And so then you start to think, this is my point from earlier. So if you've studied this first part at the cessation, then you start to think, well, how do I achieve that? How do I get to that state? And so then comes the path, right? So it makes sense, right? So now Maitreya is going to explain the truth of the path, right, to that, which is part of the Dharma jewel, right? How do you achieve that? And again, path in Buddhism is not some external, like through trees or something, right? It's not a worn thing you walk on. It's a mental path, right? It's a path of the mind. And so again, Maitreya is going to explain the path using three main points. And so in our text, it says pure, clear, and of the antidotal class. Yep.
I had a question on the cessation of mind.
Yep.
So I guess from Gelugpa's point of view, cessation is supposed to be unconditioned. So, and we're saying there's a cause to that. How do we tie that up together?
Good question. Yeah. What they there are two. I mentioned this last time. So I should go back. So when they talk about cessation, that there are two versions of there are two aspects to cessation, you can say. And the way the phrasing that they sometimes use is there's I'll use the actual phrasing that Khenpo Rinpoche used when he taught it, that Art Engel was the translator. I like his phrasing. There's the innate purity, which is free of self-existence, and there's the adventitious purity, which is free of karma and mental afflictions. So his point was, I'll explain it kind of a little bit, is when they talk about cessation, and this is following particularly the Prasangika Madhyamaka approach, that I'll start with the innate purity, free of self-existence aspect of cessation is that is emptiness, right? So in other words, and that can be understood particularly as that there is the mind of the person who's achieved such cessation is empty, and it always was empty. And we'll get to this actually in the Sangha jewel, but also even the mental afflictions themselves were actually Asanga says this is quite difficult to understand. He actually says that. He says, but that the mental afflictions themselves are pure of existing intrinsically, of ever having existed intrinsically. And so that innate purity, which is the emptiness of the mind, is uncaused. Clearly, that's obviously uncaused because it's an emptiness, right? It's a lack of intrinsic existence. Nothing brings about that lack, nothing removed that intrinsic existence because it never existed in the first place. So it's primordially pure, they call it. So that one clearly is uncaused, right? In the sense that it's an emptiness. Then this is that the other one though, the adventitious purity, which is free of karma and mental afflictions. That is the one you have to practice the path to achieve, right? Because we currently have karma and mental afflictions, and we have to practice a path to eliminate them. So that one, in one sense, you could say there is a cause for that, which is practicing the path, right? So, but one point that's worth contemplating is, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Like, is the lack, from our perspective, I'll say it this way, we do have to practice a path to achieve that. And at the same time, is the lack of something a caused phenomenon? In the sense, is it impermanent from moment to moment, right? And there is so that's an interesting question, isn't it? To contemplate is because once you've achieved that kind of the adventitious cessation, it's the mere lack of the existence of karma and mental afflictions. The mind of that person, so I'm going to differentiate something. That person's mind does have a cause, the previous moment of their mind, right? It's a continuum. But does the lack of, I'll just ask you to think about it, like, does the lack of, say, mental afflictions in that mind, is that a caused phenomenon or not? That's an interesting question to think about.
It almost looks like approaching it from a conventional point of view when you say path. That's how it sounds to me.
Yeah, so from our perspective, it is useful to think of it as a cause in the sense that we need to practice that in order to, and actually, Gyaltsab makes a point related to this, which is he says, he's actually debating. He said, some people say that Buddhahood is uncaused, right? Because it's already existed. So some people say that, right? Oh, you're already a Buddha, for example. And Gyaltsab says, who's Lama Tsongkhapa's heart disciple, he says, the Prajnaparamita sutras themselves say you have to have the cause of enlightenment is the path of seeing and the path of preparation, which is the path, right? What we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And then he says, so to say there's no cause, and then to say the cause is the path of seeing and the path of preparation would be self-contradictory, so it's wrong. So he says there is a cause. So he says conventionally Gyaltsab takes the position from the innate purity, there is no, it's uncaused. But in terms of the adventitious purity, he argues the paths are the cause of the result state. So there is a cause on that conventional level.
So almost like it feels to me that almost like emptiness. It's the same thing, cessation, in somewhat similar vein. So I say because it is like gravity, emptiness of this, emptiness of me, emptiness. It is there. It's always there. Same thing.
And uncaused.
Cessation seems like that. It's always there.
And that's Chandrakirti says. What Chandrakirti says in the Majjhimaka Avatara is the ultimate reference for cessation is an emptiness. Therefore, it's uncaused. So that's his stance.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah. So, I guess to try and understand what you're saying. So the Buddha nature is sort of inherent and sort of uncaused in that way. But since we don't have that mind right now, or it's not, I guess, at the forefront. So is the idea that, so we have like the negative karma, which was caused by actions, and so to get rid of it, to bring the Buddha nature to the forefront, we need to purify, so sort of the cause of getting to the Buddha nature needs to be caused by things like purification practices, things like that. Is that kind of to square the cause and the inherent nature of ideas? Or
Let me say it back and see, like, so one point is that, like, everybody always has Buddha nature, is one point. So even, all the teaching, they say, they give examples, they say animals have Buddha nature, and so on. So all beings have Buddha nature. So, and since the final meaning of Buddha nature is that, you could say, is that the mind is empty of inherent existence. That's uncaused. That's it's uncaused, and it's the actual nature of the mind, and it's nobody has to make that the nature of the mind. It is already the nature of the mind. So that's one point. And then I guess the second point you were getting at, though, was like the purification, and so you can say it this way, that what obscures that, right? Because that is already our nature, right? But the mental afflictions that we have, like our anger, our pride, our greed, and so on, obscure that. And so I think I think that's what you were saying, right? So that we have to practice the path in order to. Actually, there are two reasons why we have to practice the path. Really, one is to remove those obscurations, right? To remove those things that are obscuring it. That's what you were kind of saying, right? Yeah, so that's right. I guess, and the other reason why we have to practice the path, because they say purification and accumulation. The other is to accumulate causes for, actually, I'll say that in the text, for example, they're all the attributes of the Buddha. So like the Buddha's, for the Buddha's bodies. So we have to practice virtue that sort of results eventually in the achieve. Because in other words, Buddhas don't exist intrinsically. They also, especially the Buddha's body, for example, has to have certain not karmic, but certain, sorry, we say right, accumulation of virtuous causes. So you do certain virtuous actions in order to achieve the Buddha's body. So those are the reasons. So does that make sense? Kind of. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation of cessation. That'd be very helpful. You mentioned it's a cessation of mental afflictions and cessation of karma. My question is, we're talking about cessation of generation of new karma, or we would still be subject to our previous karma on cessation?
It's actually an interesting point. Like, so, we'll get to this more later in the text, but what they actually say in this text is an interesting point. So tell me if this answers your question, because this text has an interesting sort of explanation on what happens. And so what they actually say, you'll see it in the section on the Sangha here, but we'll jump ahead in a second. What they actually say is that up until, like, so, we take rebirth through the power of karma and mental afflictions. That's how we, when we die, our mental afflictions and our karma, they often say throw us, right? The throwing karma, right? It throws us to a new rebirth. And one point they make is that, so that in terms of the cessation, right, is that once you achieve the path of seeing, so once a bodhisattva has seen emptiness directly on the path of seeing, they say they no longer take rebirth through the power of karma and mental afflictions. And it's interesting the way they say it, though, is that I once asked Ken Rinpoche about this, and he said, such a bodhisattva is not a Buddha, and they're still within samsara, but they're not a samsaric being. And I said, what does that mean, that they're still in samsara, but they're not a samsaric being? And he said, they're still in samsara in the sense they have not completely eliminated the mental afflictions 100%. If they're not at the eighth bhumi yet. So the first bhumi, second bhumi, third bhumi of bodhisattvas. Then he said, but they're not a samsaric, so they are in samsara, but they're not a samsaric being because they didn't take rebirth to the power of karma and mental afflictions. Such a bodhisattva takes rebirth through the power of compassion and prayers and love, actually. So they take a new rebirth in order to continue working for others and practicing the path. So one point that they're making there is that a bodhisattva at that level, at those paths, at those levels of the path, haven't completely eliminated karma, actually, but karma no longer has the power to determine their rebirth. They've overpowered that, in a sense, through their seeing of reality. And then, but at that point, because you were getting at, have they eliminated karma? So that bodhisattva has eliminated the power of karma to throw their rebirth, but not completely eliminated karma. And then, then there comes a point, like at Buddhahood, then they have completely eliminated karma. So, and another way that they sometimes say it is that also once the bodhisattva has seen emptiness directly, that go back to your point, so they don't create new impure, karmas like that, but they do, but they haven't completely purified their old karma. But at that level of the path, their karma can no longer determine their rebirth. That's what they say in this text, which is interesting, subtle distinctions, but interesting to think about. So like when we say, in the Tibetan tradition, Tibetan Buddhist tradition, when they talk about like, it's interesting when they talk about like tulkus, right? The people, like, oh, this was a person who like recognized that Rinpoche tulkus, right? Actually, they're all different levels of tulku then, aren't they? Like, so I mean, if you study that, there's a whole teachings on that, but one level of that would be, so there are many different, it's actually confusing sometimes because in tradition you just say, oh, this is the tulku of somebody, but actually that can mean many different things. It could just mean somebody recognized an ordinary person who took rebirth, but they were a good person, so they were practicing the path, and a high lama could say, oh, that was this abbot before, and they haven't yet achieved this level. It's one possibility, but in other levels they've achieved this possibility, and it means they are somebody who's taken rebirth through the power of their prayers and their compassion, and not in an ordinary way. Then it can also mean an emanation of a Buddha. So there are all different levels that it can refer to, but this is one of them, I guess, is what we were just talking about. But yeah, other questions about cessation, right ones. So maybe I'll say a little about the path then, which is the cause in a way of cessation.
I had one, Lauren, if it's okay.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Yeah, I very, very much appreciated that question earlier, that they raised that whole topic about cessation and being caused or uncaused, because that's something I've looked at a lot. And if my recollection is correct, one teaching I heard some years ago was that there are only three uncaused things, emptiness, space, and cessation. And I had trouble with that last one because, as that person was indicating, it appears that cessation, by virtue of practicing the path, is a caused event. And the thing that helped me most to try to reconcile that was paying attention to the teaching on the two truths, conventional versus ultimate reality, because even though those things can appear contradictory, that reconciles it, because it shifts your perspective from our condition of having the Tathagata versus enlightenment. And so that's one thing. And also, just in my experience throughout the years, I've encountered so many people, who are following the Buddhist path and have the notion that they don't need to do anything special, because the teaching, of course, is, especially in the Zen tradition, is that we're already enlightened. So therefore, there's nothing I need to do. So, and I've tried to counter that as best I could, but I think, again, this notion of the two truths, when you study the scriptures and don't disparage them, really helps a lot. So thank you for raising that topic. So.
Oh, it was Rajiv who asked, but yeah. Well, thanks for your comment. And yeah, so and I think it is important. I also think it's important. A couple of quick points on that. One is I think part of it, sometimes what can be confusing about the truth of cessation is its nature, is that different tenet systems explain it somewhat differently. And really that's why I mentioned Chandrakirti in his Majjhima Avatara. The Prasangika position from Chandrakirti is that as I mentioned, is that the ultimate referent of cessation is an emptiness, whereas some other tenet systems don't refer to it that way. They say, no, it's a conventionally existent phenomenon. It's the stopping of something. So there are different positions, is one point I would make on that from different tenet systems. So even when you think about it, you have to kind of remember, am I asking that from the perspective of the mind-only school, or from the perspective of the Vaibhashika versus, or from the perspective of a, because even like the Vaibhashikas think of cessation as, the after death, like an arhat after death, for example, what they're in a state of cessation. So there are different positions from different Buddhist schools of what cessation means. And they're all useful, actually. They're not wrong. It's just that there are different levels of subtlety. Some of the answers are much more subtle, and others are more simple in a way, or simplistic, and then others are subtler. So that's just one point, is that sometimes I think when people talk about the nature of cessation, it's confusing because we have to, in a way, clarify which Buddhist philosophical system we're sort of talking from a perspective of. So anyway, just when you said it, made me think of that.
It raises a whole other point, and maybe you intend to get into this later, but the translation and commentary that I've been studying is in the Kagyu tradition, and they raise repeatedly, especially in the annotations that I've been studying, the Kempo is raising this issue of the emptiness of self versus emptiness of other school. And I don't have a lot of exposure to that, but to the extent I've dug into it, it's very, very interesting. And is that something you will be addressing later?
Yeah, well, Gyaltsab Je addresses that very directly and strongly, actually. Lama Tsongkhapa, who was his, was pictured here in the center. Behind me, you can see it central, right behind me, it's Lama Tsongkhapa. And Gyaltsab Je is there, actually. He was the first person to hold Tsongkhapa's throne after Tsongkhapa. So they take a very, there's like a debate in Tibetan Buddhism sometimes on this point, and we'll cover it more. But Gyaltsab Je, in his commentary on this text, Lama Tsongkhapa and Gyaltsab Je took quite a strong position philosophically that, let's say it this way, that in Tibetan they call it Rongtong and Shentong, but the Rongtong is empty of nature, empty of self, is the correct understanding of what emptiness means. And Lama Tsongkhapa actually said, and Gyaltsab Je follows him, kind of say that empty of other, when you go through the actual philosophical implications of that, is not even really it doesn't accord with any of the Buddhist schools of philosophy, whereas some Kagyu teachers would disagree with that. But we'll go into that. Yeah, I'll set aside time at some point when we get to a certain part where Gyaltsab Je addresses it, where we'll actually go into it, because it's quite a complicated subject that the Dalai Lama has also addressed a fair amount, because his non-sectarian approach, which is, he kind of will follow Tsongkhapa and then also kind of explain other positions. But I'll set aside time and we'll actually go over that because it's related to this text.
Did John ask a question about selflessness of phenomena?
Yeah. So yeah, we'll set aside time though. I'm not today, but at another time. Yeah. But okay, let's see. Yeah, good. Okay, so then the truth of the path. So he covers that, as I said, in 3 points. And the first one is, and you'll see them in the text here, it said pure, clear, and of an antidotal class. So this is the truth of the path, right? Which we're getting at here is the experience of a bodhisattva on the path, right? The mind, right? Because I said path is a mind, right? So it's something that happens in the experience, in the mind, the continuum of a bodhisattva. And particularly what we're talking about here is Arya path, right? Noble path, which means the path that whose nature is seeing emptiness directly, right? So it's that kind of path. So the first one is purity, right? Pure, or purity. And by the way, I want to say something too here. You'll see if you look at the text that these 3 points about the path are Maitreya uses an analogy of the sun, sunlight, right? So the sun is pure, clear, and an antidote to darkness is the idea, and that it's a metaphor for the mind of the bodhisattva at this point. So that the mind is like the sun, is the idea here. So the first one is pure, right? Like, so this sunlight it's light, it's pure. And what does it mean by pure here? So he says, there are different, I'll read a few different points. So this is, there are no obstacles or no seeds present, is one way to say it. So what does that mean? So Asanga says, the nature of this path is not mixed with any obscurations. It's not mixed, so it's a pure, intuitive or internal experience of wisdom, directly realizing selflessness or emptiness that is free of all taints of the mental afflictions. And so actually what this is getting at, you have to pause and sort of reflect on it for a moment. The experience of the bodhisattva that this is getting at, the path, right, is when they're in a meditative equipoise and they're directly realizing emptiness. And at that time, nothing else is appearing to their mind, right? When they're in a meditative absorption on emptiness, their mind is completely, in a, they say, non-dualistic way. They often say like water poured into water. When you pour water, if you pour if you pour like a cup of water into a bowl of or a pitcher of water, and you wait a moment, you can't tell, right? Where was the cup of water and where's the water that was in the pitcher to start with? They mix in a kind of inseparable way. So the experience of the bodhisattva at this point on the path is like that, where the mind and emptiness are completely mixed, with no other appearances, no other concepts, or no concepts actually. It's non-conceptual realization. And so for that bodhisattva at that time, first of all, there are no obstacles. One meaning of no obstacles, there are no obstacles to realizing emptiness anymore. Like before that point on the path of preparation, the bodhisattva has realized emptiness, but there's still a little bit of dualism. There's still a little bit of, there's like, they call it a subtle conceptuality. It's still not direct. There's still some kind of conceptual veil, they sometimes will say, where there's still a little bit of a dualistic conception of, oh, that's emptiness. Oh, that's what emptiness is like. It's not quite that gross, but it's like that. There's a sense of dualistic. And there's a little bit of a mental image of emptiness still. Here, that mental image has been completely broken through. So there's no longer any obstacle to seeing emptiness directly. That's one point. Another point is that no mental afflictions are present at all, right? And even there's no taint of mental affliction present. You couldn't have the slightest mental affliction in that moment. It's completely a pure experience of emptiness with no taint of any mental afflictions present. Even the mental affliction of ignorance is not present at all at that time. Where before that, there's always been, actually it's disturbing sometimes if you think about that, the teaching on this, because they actually say until you realize emptiness directly, there's always getting at the opposite of purity, a taint, a stain to our experience of ignorance. We see things as if they exist intrinsically. Even if we're reflecting on emptiness, it's disturbing actually. Even if you're reflecting on emptiness, if we're not an Arya Bodhisattva, our concept of emptiness is tainted by our sense of dualism, our sense of things existing in and of themselves. So we see emptiness as if it existed inherently. And we can't help it because our ignorance is still so habituated and so imprinted on ourselves. At this point, the bodhisattva has a completely pure experience with no taint of ignorance, no taint of any mental affliction, and no taint of even not even their concept of emptiness. There's no longer even a concept of emptiness, which is still a taint in a sense that it's conceptual. And with the concept comes a sense of as if it exists from its own side, intrinsically, not empty. So it's not. So at this point, anyway, the point being here, purity means, now you get it, no obstacles at all. no taints at all in that sense. Then, and this is the path, right? So the path is like that. Right? Then clarity is the next one, right? Yeah, it says clear or clarity. And the metaphor here is just as the sun clearly illuminates everything, so the Bodhisattva's mind clearly illuminates at this point. Gyaltsab says, the brilliant with the light of intuitive wisdom that experientially realizes thatness or emptiness. And I'll pause here and sort of reflect on something to clarify it. Because this clarity point is getting at something about the path, and it's trying to help us understand it. So one point is that, the mind's so the mind is clear and luminous, and it can realize emptiness. And so one part of this experience of the path is that experience. So that the Bodhisattva has this mind that's utterly clear, that, as we already said, is pure in the sense that it's free from these taints or obscurations. And so it can clarify or clearly realize the meaning of emptiness and utterly illuminate it, like the sun illuminates objects. And you see it directly, just like, if you look at something, we can look at an object in the sunlight and we can see it clearly, just like that, the mind can see emptiness. So in that sense, the mind's clarity fully reveals the truth of emptiness. That's one meaning. Then, in terms of the path, the commentators say, also though, for the Bodhisattva, not a Buddha. In a Buddha, there is no post-meditative state. Buddha never leaves meditation. Even as the Buddha goes around and teaches, they're in meditation. The Buddha can talk to you and travel and walk and so on, and they're still completely in a meditative absorption. Bodhisattvas can't do that. Right? They can't yet. Only a Buddha can do that. Bodhisattvas have to go back and forth between meditative absorption, where they're directly realizing emptiness, and then they come out of that and they call it post-meditative state, where they go and do the 6 other perfections, right? You have to leave meditation to practice generosity, right? To go give beings things. You have to leave meditation to practice patience, right? You have to go find somebody to be difficult, then you can be patient with them. And that's part of the practice of bodhisattvas, right? They go find difficult people to practice patience with. And they find people who are in need to practice generosity with. So you have to have these post-meditative states as a bodhisattva, right? It's part of the path. So we're talking about the path here, right? And so, so part of the point they're getting at is this clarity point, because the purity is just the meditative equipoise on emptiness. Clarity includes the clear knowing of emptiness, but it also includes the post-meditative state. And what it's getting at is that that post-meditative state is also part of the truth of the path. Or so that when a bodhisattva arises from that direct realization of emptiness, and they go around practicing ethics and practicing generosity and practicing patience and so on, that their mind is still clear. Does that make sense? And that they see conventional phenomena now in a different way as part of the implication. And at the Buddha level, it's omniscience, right? Buddha is omniscient. Buddha sees all conventionalities simultaneously and directly. The Bodhisattva is not capable of that yet. But the Bodhisattva has a kind of, we'll get into this more in the Truth of the Sangha, or the Sangha Jewel, but about what is the Bodhisattva's experience. But one way of saying it is that the Bodhisattva, after they've directly realized emptiness and then they're practicing the 6 perfections, there's that, it doesn't say this in the commentary, but I'm going to use a different Buddhist point. There's an analogy that's often used in teachings on emptiness, which is that they often use this analogy, right? The magician who does like a magic trick, right? And then they have 3 people in that one. There's the magician, there's the audience, and then there's the person who comes like kind of comes late and maybe can see that, can see the what's the word? Isn't fooled, in other words. And the analogy is here that ordinary people are like the audience, because we're fooled by the trick, right? We see things incorrectly. The person who came late and isn't tricked at all is the Buddha. You know, they don't see, they don't even see illusory things. They see things as they are only. But the magician is like the bodhisattva. That's the analogy, in the sense that the magician who does a magic trick, in this analogy, what they say actually is like, that the magician sees things the way the audience sees them. They see the trick, in other words, but they know how it's being done, so they don't believe it, right? They still see the appearance of the trick, but they don't believe that it's real because they know how the trick is being accomplished. That's the way to say it. So in the same way, like that, I'm just using that analogy to get it part of the clarity here. The bodhisattva in post-meditative equipoise is said to be like the magician. In other words, when they leave meditative equipoise, they still see things then, as if they're intrinsically existent. But they now know it doesn't exist that way, because they've seen it directly, you know, and nothing can fool them anymore. So, but they can't help it. Due to their past imprints, they still see things dualistically. They still see things as if they're intrinsically real. That's how they perceive objects, but they don't believe that perception anymore. They know it's like a play, or like just a display, a magical appearance. They use different analogies. So for that bodhisattva, also in this post-meditative equipoise, that's an analogy that's often given for what their experience is like, is that they're no longer fooled by appearances of things, but they still have those appearances due to past imprints. And part of the practice of the path is that they gradually eliminate those habitual patterns. So I think that's part of what's being gotten at here in terms of clarity. And then the last of these 3 points about the path is what in our translation, it calls it antidote or antidotal class. One other translation called it medicinal, which that's an interesting translation. But it's an antidote. And what does that mean? It means that, what I was just getting at, that this kind of practice gradually eliminates the 3 kinds of obstacles, meaning the 3 poisons: desire, hatred, and ignorance. And it's a remedy to all the obstructions that we have to seeing emptiness, to seeing things as they are. And then it says just that, so there are a couple of points made that I'll just share. One is, just as the sun, light, because remember the sun is the metaphor here, just as the sun is the antidote to darkness, no matter, darkness is eliminated by sunlight, just so the mental afflictions are eliminated by this kind of path, this seeing of emptiness directly. And then it goes into a little more detail, which I've covered to some extent already, but I'll just say it briefly, which are that it actually explains that. So it just says, in the commentary, it says, up until this point, right, of the path of seeing emptiness directly, and then the Arya paths, we perceive things, first of all, as though they were inherently existent from their own side. And we grasp at that appearance, right, as if it's real. And then, actually, they don't say it this way, but I'm going to add a point, which is one that's said in the Buddhist teachings, which is once you grasp at things as if they're intrinsically existent, the mind of ignorance, that kind of mind, gives rise to countless different elaborations, based on that inherent existence. And that's what it starts to get at here in this teaching. So it says, then you start to see things as if they're inherently attractive, and you start to give rise to desire. And you see things as if they're inherently unattractive, and you start to give rise to hatred and anger. And you start to see, give rise to then comparisons, right? Like, well, this is more attractive than that, and I'm better than you, or this person's better than me, and there are all these different mental elaborations of inherent existence that we engage in that give rise to then all the different mental effects, right? So if you see something as inherently attractive, then you start craving for it, or greedy for it, or want, and so on. Then when you see something as inherently unattractive, you start to be averse to it, and then you could become angry, and then you become truly hateful and spiteful and vengeful and all those things. And those are all variations, right? And they all arise due to first seeing things as intrinsically existent. And then you start to see intrinsic, they call it intrinsic characteristics. And the truth is, of course, nothing has any intrinsic characteristics. And there are many different points that are easy to see if you actually think about it, right? Like, for example, if something were intrinsically, you could, like, let's say a person, you see them as intrinsically unattractive and you're angry at them. But at the same moment, somebody else could look at them and see them as attractive and wonderful. And that happens all the time, doesn't it? Like, the person who you can't stand, somebody else thinks is wonderful. And then also, like, the opposite, right? If you see something as intrinsically wonderful, right? Somebody else could look at that. Like, if you think, it's easy to see examples, right? You might think, oh, like, this certain food is quite wonderful. Somebody else, if they look at it, they feel like sick, to even see it or something, right? So, and we feel like, no, it's intrinsically, you can even argue, right? No, that's really good. No, it's not. As if it has some intrinsic characteristic to itself, which of course it doesn't, which is why it's a ridiculous argument, right? So once you see things, and actually go back to that feeling, right? It's funny, isn't it? Like, you really feel like you'd want to argue the case. Like, or if somebody said, like, let's say you're talking to a friend, you say, oh, this person's really wonderful. They say, oh, I can't stand them. You would start to have an argument. No, they're really great. No, they're not good. As if there's something intrinsic, right, to that person. But there isn't, of course. Neither one is. There are no intrinsically existing characteristics. Does that make sense? But do you see, this point is getting at, first you have to grasp at things as if they exist intrinsically. Then inevitably you start imputing intrinsic characteristics onto them, which then give rise to all these different, right? And actually, you can see countless examples of this, isn't it? But everything, actually, that's how all suffering, this is Buddhist teaching, isn't it? That's how all suffering happens, isn't it? Everything from, like, fights in a family to wars, it's this, isn't it? It's this process of seeing things as if they were intrinsically the way you think they are, which don't exist that way, right? So groups of people, right? How does it happen in a family where people have a certain view of somebody else and they have this view? But even if you look at, like, right, number of wars in the world, and it's clear, right? It's like people seeing other people as if they exist intrinsically in a certain way in which they never existed, actually, is the point. So this kind of meditation is the antidote to all of that. Does that make sense? That's what it's saying, is when you meditate, and actually, because just to get the point here, I'll just it's time to say this. One version of an antidote is what we call in Buddhism temporary antidotes, right? And that's where, like, so for example, you just start to recognize you're exaggerating. So if you can just do that, it helps, right? Like, temporarily. And there are many Buddhist teachings on that, right? Like, so the person who's very greedy, for example, right? And they start to think of, oh, wait a second, like, you could actually reflect. It's not that hard, right? So if you're very greedy, you think, I need a lot of money. And then you think, well, wait a second, there's some very rich people who kill themselves. There are very rich people who are totally miserable. So just being rich in and of itself is not intrinsically desirable, or everybody who's rich would be happy, and they're not. Or they have those meditations, right? They tell, like, if a person's very lustful, right? They see, oh, meditate on the faults of whoever you're like the kind of person you're lustful for, their body, right? Like, it gets sick and it dies and it's impermanent, and the inside is all disgusting. It's all, so you think about that, right? And if it's if the person's craving after a woman, then you think about a woman's body. If they're craving after a man, you think about a man's body. It doesn't really matter. It's the same point. So those are temporary antidotes, right? Because they decrease our exaggeration. We're exaggerating the quality of something, and then you meditate on why that's an exaggeration. And if you start to see it's an exaggeration, it can help some. What this teaching, though, is getting at is that those are temporary, right? If you can uproot the perception, the habit of perceiving things as though they exist intrinsically to begin with, then you undercut all exaggerations. You don't have to work on every single one. You know what I mean? Like, oh, it's like this, and oh, I'm exaggerating that. Because actually, we have countless exaggerations, don't we? All day. So here, the idea is that if you can meditate in this clear, pure way on emptiness, then it will be an antidote to all those different mental afflictions and all those different conceptual elaborations based on inherent existence. And so in that way, you'll eliminate the obstacles to your own liberation and also to omniscience or Buddhahood. And that's the nature of the path, is that the path is a practice of meditating on the ultimate nature of reality, its emptiness, in order to eliminate the obstacles to liberation, which are the mental afflictions, and also the obstacles to omniscience, which are the imprints of the mental afflictions. And so that's a summary. So then it's saying, so that's what the path is that kind of meditation. And all the, it says there are a number of Buddhist texts. I mean, Chandrakirti says this, but also I think Shantideva also says it, I think. Yeah, I think so there are a number of Buddhist masters who say all the different Buddhist teachings, there are countless, 84,000 different Buddhist teachings and so on, they say, right? And what a number of masters say, they all eventually lead to this direct, so the bodhisattva's meditative equipoise that's clear and pure on emptiness. Because that's conjoined with bodhicitta, right? So the bodhisattva means somebody who has bodhicitta. And then when they enter this kind of meditative equipoise, that's what all these different practices are leading towards. Does that make sense? Because that's the direct antidote to the mental afflictions, and it's the thing that allows us to achieve Buddhahood, to get close to Buddhahood. So that when we say path, we're saying that's that's the ultimate reference for the path. It's this kind of meditation, and you get the point now. That path leads to cessation. Okay, so and that's how the Buddha, that's how this text explains the Dharma jewel. It's quite a beautiful, isn't it? Like you go, wow. You have a different, for me, I get a different appreciation of when you say, oh, I go for refuge of the Buddha, I go for refuge of the Dharma, I go for refuge of the Sangha. It's good, any version of that, it's good. But when you think of it in this way, it's quite deep presentation of the meaning of the Dharma. So maybe I'll pause there. Is any questions about that before, any questions about that? Not that you have to, I don't want to rush ahead if people have questions. Because if not, then maybe I'll just start on the third jewel, the Sangha, and then we'll pick up on it. It's next week is another class, I'll pick up on it then, but yeah, I'll at least cover the first point because it's fun. I find this first point. So then the last of the three jewels, right? Which is the third Vajra point, is the Sangha jewel. And again, it's covered in 8 points, and so on. But I want to start by I'm not going to cover those 8 points yet. I just want to start with something simpler, or a big preliminary point, which is taught in the teachings. And so it says, who are they referring to here when they say the Sangha jewel in this text? That makes sense. And the commentaries by Asanga and Gyatso Je say, they make a couple points. One is they say, on a practical level, first of all, the Sangha jewel comes from the Dharma jewel. So the Buddha teaches the Dharma, and then by those who listen to the Dharma and practice it become the Sangha, right? So that's the Sangha jewel. And they say here, though, there are various different reference to the word Sangha that you could have, And it says this text, when it talks about the Sangha jewel, is referring to non-regressing bodhisattvas. That's specific, so that's this text reference. It says non-regressing bodhisattvas. And then it says, well, what is a non-regressing? You could ask, what's a non-regressing bodhisattva? Right? What does that mean? And this is starting to get at the question from earlier, but so what he said, the Asanga and so on say, there are two ways to understand that. Two different ways that you could understand this word non-regressing. Bodhisattva, we know, right, means somebody who's, first of all, in general, bodhisattva is somebody who's realized bodhicitta, right? And realized bodhicitta means it's not, we can all, first of all, we do all hopefully cultivate bodhicitta, right? And with effort, we contemplate compassion and love, and we give rise to bodhicitta. For a bodhisattva is somebody for whom that's spontaneous and natural. Because they cultivated it for a long time, it becomes their natural way of being, right? So that when they go to sleep at night, it's with that kind of mind. When they wake up in the morning, it's with that kind of mind. When they eat lunch, it's with that kind of mind. When they walk, it's with that kind of, so that bodhicitta pervades all of their experiences. It's their how they approach everything. But then what is a non-regressing bodhisattva? And so these texts say there are two ways to understand that. One is what I was saying earlier, which is they don't regress to taking rebirth by the power of karma and mental afflictions. And what that means is that they're not just any kind of bodhisattva, right? What kind of bodhisattva doesn't take rebirth through the power of karma and mental afflictions? We talked about that a few minutes ago. And so that means they're an Arya bodhisattva, meaning a bodhisattva who sees emptiness directly. So they're at least on the first boon, right? They've achieved, of the 5 paths, right? The path of accumulation begins when you realize bodhicitta. And then there's a small and middle and the great levels of the path of accumulation where you're strengthening your bodhicitta and studying emptiness and learning about emptiness. You may realize emptiness conceptually, you develop calm abiding, and so on. And then there's the path of accumulation, which begins when you already have bodhicitta at that point, but you achieve the union of calm abiding and special insight. So you have that experience, and you achieve the path of preparation. That's quite a remarkable achievement, right? The bodhisattva, that's the person who has realized bodhicitta, has calm abiding meditation, and has realized emptiness conceptually, and then has achieved a union of their conceptual understanding of emptiness with their calm abiding meditation. It's quite a powerful state. And there are 4 subdivisions of the path of preparation that you progress through, where your veils for understanding emptiness get thinner and thinner. So your understanding of emptiness, at first it's still quite gross conceptuality, and it becomes subtler and subtler veil. And the final level of the path of preparation is called the supreme mundane dharma. It's a state where it's like the state last meditation session of not being an Arya, where you have this very slight still conceptual, going back to purity, right? Impurity, this very slight conceptual veil where you understand emptiness quite well, but it's still not direct. And that final stage is where it's called the supreme mundane dharma. So it's the last of the mundane experiences before you meditate on it just one more time and directly perceive emptiness. You break through that final veil and you see it directly, right? So then you've achieved the path of seeing. And so this is saying non-regressing bodhisattvas have at least achieved the path of seeing. Then they progress through the 10 grounds of the bodhisattvas on the path of meditation until they eventually achieve Buddhahood, the path of no more learning, they call it, the 5th path, the path of no more learning. So here, when they say non-regressing bodhisattva, one way of defining that is it's somebody who's achieved at least the path of seeing, is an Arya bodhisattva there, noble, right? Noble bodhisattva, meaning they've seen emptiness directly. And so such a person then they don't regress anymore to taking rebirth through the power of karma and mental afflictions. Their rebirth, what they actually say, going back to a little more detail on that question, is they say such a person has, they actually say, the way they say it is they have a body, a mental body, and that they take rebirth through the power of prayer, compassion, and prayer and compassionate aspiration. So that's such a bodhisattva. And so they don't fall back to kind of being under the sway of karma and mental afflictions, or having it overpower them and throw them into rebirth. And so they have a different kind of body then, as part of the point, because our body is conditioned. Our body is conditioned. Whenever I said Khenpo Rinpoche made that point, they're in samsara, but not a samsaric being. Like our being, our mind and body are samsaric in the sense that they're thrown by the power of mental afflictions and karma, right? That's what created, like this body and this mind are created by karma and mental afflictions. Their body's not like that, and their mind are not like that. It can look, they could look like a person to us, but from their inner experience, they don't suffer in the same way. They don't experience things in the same way because they came to this incarnation or this embodiment out of love and compassion, not like us, so that's what so anyway, the great bodhisattvas are like that. So one meaning of Sangha Jewel is that they're that kind of bodhisattva. Then the other meaning of non-regressing is that one no longer regresses to thoughts, that such a bodhisattva no longer regresses to thoughts of self-centeredness or selfishness. And there are different points that they make, and I don't know how much detail we're going to use in detail, but part of the idea here is that I'll say, first I'll say the way Kime Kintsugi said it. He said that once you become a bodhisattva, like you actually realize bodhicitta, for a while, you were previously habituated to self-centered approach, which is what ordinary people have, right? And so, so those early phase bodhisattvas will still sometimes have a passing thought of like selfishness, and then they'll kind of go, "Oh, wow, that's strange," and they kind of leave it aside. Whereas these bodhisattvas no longer even have a passing thought; they're past that level. They no longer have even a passing. And then there are different teachings actually where they say, I don't even know if we need these details, but yeah. We'll share it if we're interested, I guess, briefly. So the Prajnaparamita literature, the perfection of wisdom literature, teaches 22 kinds of bodhicitta achieved on the path, along the path. So you can actually study those if you want to study it in the Prajnaparamita. And we first achieve like a new bodhicitta on the small level of the path of accumulation. That's when we first achieve bodhicitta. I'll make a couple points. One is at that level, you can actually still lose your bodhicitta. While you're still on the small level of the path accumulation, that's where sometimes you'll read in the sutras, they'll actually say they say that of Shariputra, for example, that Shariputra was once a bodhisattva and then he lost his body. Somebody, I think it was, I forget. I think somebody asked for a body part and he cut off the body part and gave it to them, but then they complained he gave it with the wrong hand. And he thought, I can't work for all beings. This is too hard. He said, I'm just going to achieve my own liberation. So that would be an example of somebody who achieved bodhicitta, but then lost it. But on the middle level of the path of accumulation, of the 22, you achieve the second, which is the golden bodhicitta. And it says, once you get to that level, you won't lose your bodhicitta. So that's one part of the definition of the middle level of path of accumulation, is that you achieve this golden bodhicitta, which means you've become strong enough in your bodhicitta, you won't lose your bodhicitta. Khenpo Rinpoche said, but at that level, the bodhisattva can still have a passing thought, selfish. Like they can still think, oh, this is kind of tiring or something. These people are really difficult. Later, they don't even think that, and so on. They keep progressing in your bodhicittas. But Khenpo Rinpoche pointed out, he said, by the time you achieve this golden bodhicitta, the middle level, the path of accumulation, you won't lose your bodhicitta anymore. But you can still have a passing thought. So then they keep going. And then he said, I'll just make 2 more points, then we'll stop. Then he said, once you achieve the path of seeing and the first bodhisattva bhumi, which I was mentioning earlier, then even though earlier you couldn't lose your bodhicitta, then it's not even theoretically possible to lose your bodhicitta. That's what he put. But on the first bhumi, he actually said you could still have the passing thought. And then he said, when you get to the 8th bhumi of the bodhisattvas, all mental afflictions have ceased. And he said at that level, such a bodhisattva, nothing could make them even have a passing thought of self-centeredness. So somebody could be murdering them or killing them or chopping off their limbs, and they wouldn't have the slightest even beginning of a thought of self-centered thought. They would only be concerned for the person who's attacking them. So there are different levels. My point here is that there are different levels of bodhicitta. And so when you say non-regressing bodhisattvas, it's somebody who they will never, you could say, they'll never lose their bodhi, they'll never fall back. So you could think, well, you could think of which level, that refers. There are different levels of that, not falling back. Do you mean not falling back at all, like the first level, or do you mean not even having a thought? So there are different levels of Arya Bodhisattva. And actually, I'll just share part of why I shared that is like, if you think of those different levels of Bodhisattva, then it feels inspiring. And we think, I want to take refuge in them. If once you understand this, then when you say I take refuge in the Sangha, you think, oh, wow, it's that kind of Bodhisattva. Wow, that's really something remarkable. That I want to take refuge in such a being and also become such a being is the idea. So next time, then we'll cover the 8, that was like an introduction to the what does it mean, Arya, non-regressive Bodhisattva. And the next time we'll cover the 8, the list of 8 characteristics for those Bodhisattvas that explain things about how they experience, quite beautiful things about how they experience what their experiences are like. Maybe that's what they, how they experience things or what their experiences are like. That'll be next time. But so in a second, so we should do dedication. And I'll just say, and then for people who are online, I'm going to leave the link open because we're going to take like a 10-minute break or something, and then we're going to, for those who want to, you don't have to say if you don't want to, but I want to do a little bit of the reading of the Sutra of Golden Light. Particularly, it's a practice or it's a sutra, right? That's read in times for wise leadership in the world and peace. So since there are numerous wars happening and also conflicts, and also so for the benefit of people in those regions and also people in this region, people in every region, for people who feel like it, you can stay and do that. And so I'm going to leave the link open for that, but people can sign off once, or stay on, whatever you want. But we'll do the dedication now. So the supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. So the I was merely labeled and totally empty from its own side may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Larry.
Well, thank you. There's a way to stop the recording at this point. Oh, stop recording. Good.